Thank you. It's now my pleasure to welcome Michael Schreiber, the moderator for our first panel. Michael is the Chief Operating Officer at RFK Human Rights and oversees our financial operations in programmatic areas. Over his 20-year career, Michael has served in leadership roles for Deloitte, United Way, GBC Health, and Concern Worldwide. In each of these engagements, he has been responsible for overseeing organizational programs globally and domestically. Michael is the chair of the Net Impact Board and a member of the Atlas Board of Directors. He's previously served on many other boards, and we are happy to have him today. Michael, thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction. If I could ask the panelists to come on stage. Since part of my job will be making sure that we finish on time at the end, I'm going to start that practice of trying to keep us moving on pace right from the get-go. So you have the full biographies of all of the panelists in the material, but I am joined by Insha Rahman of Vera Institute, Pete Kadens, former or retired CEO of Green Thumb and currently manager of the Family Foundation, and Monica Smith, who is on our very own staff as of this year, driving the work that we do on criminal justice reform. As you can see in the description, we're going to have a bit of a conversation about the economic impact and opportunity costs of the mass incarceration environment. There are a number of different facets. We will likely not cover all of them in the prepared discussions that we have, but we will have time for conversation and questions from the audience at the end. But to get us going, I'm going to just ask each of the panelists to spend a few minutes giving us a bit of perspective from your vantage point on the scale and breadth. And Insha, I know I've learned from you every time some new ways to describe the magnitude of the mass incarceration. But I think for the benefit of the audience, give us a sense of how significant a piece of our economy and society is tied into the system.
Absolutely. And first of all, I want to start by saying thank you for holding this panel and holding this conversation here in this room of tremendous expertise and tremendous influence and tremendous power. I've been working in criminal justice reform for the better part of 2 decades, and we're in a moment that's unlike any other. And so as we're talking about mass and scale and scope, the opportunity right now to roll back mass incarceration is one that I think is unprecedented in this country. And I'm so excited that part of that is happening here in this room and among this particular community. And so Carrie started by talking about what is the scope and scale of mass incarceration. 2.3 million people in jails and prisons right now today in this country. It's also 4.5 million people under supervision, so on probation or parole. And how much does all of that cost? That costs $81 billion a year to run this system that is, in fact, mass incarceration. And I just want to name some of the profits and the incentives that drive this system and have driven the growth of mass incarceration. For one thing, private interests are everywhere in our criminal justice system. For example, the bail bond industry, the private industry that actually turns a profit in underwriting bail bonds in many, many courthouses across this country. And I'll note that America is unique and singular in having a private for-profit bail industry. It's us and the Philippines are the only 2 countries in the entire world that actually uses a cash bail system that allows for profit to be had at the point of paying bail. And that industry actually underwrites $14 billion a year in bail bonds and keeps $1.4 billion in profits. And that's $1.4 billion from the pockets of mostly Black and brown families and individuals who are paying bail to get their loved ones out of jail. Phone companies, private phone companies run the phones that are in prisons, and they can charge up to $24.95 just simply for a 15-minute conversation. And that's money that people who are incarcerated, their family members have to deposit into their commissaries in order to pay for those phone calls. Likewise, commissaries within jails and prisons are run by private companies that actually turn a profit in supplying basics like soap and shaving cream and canned goods, things like that. And that profit is $1.6 billion a year. So we're just starting to name a couple of numbers. I don't expect anybody to remember them, but what I do hope that you sort of walk out with is just how mass the sort of scale of profit and incentive is in this system that we have. And here's what the costs are to people. By age 48, a person who has been incarcerated will earn $179,000 less than if he or she had never been incarcerated. That's the damage to a person's future income and earnings that the impact of jail or prison has. And in this country, millions and millions of children and family members have loved ones who are incarcerated. And the impact of incarceration hurts those families as well. A family that has a loved one, a parent currently incarcerated, has an ability to earn that is diminished by 22% than a similarly situated family where a parent is not currently incarcerated. So I think it really bears sort of a moment of reflection to think about the profit incentive versus the costs and the harms to everyday Americans that our system of mass incarceration imposes. And what does that mean for us as taxpayers? So given that cost of $81 billion, that ends up being about $137 a year that each of us pay out towards funding the criminal justice system as it stands. And that is each year. You can just imagine sort of what that cost is over a lifetime that each of us are actually investing in this justice system, which I think many of us would find unjust at the very least. And I also want to just say this, is we have often assumed that the system that we have is there because it needs to be there. Well, back in 1970, we actually only had 300,000 people in jail or prison on any given day, and now we've ballooned to 2.2 million. But we actually have an opportunity to scale that back, and we have great examples that I'm sure will come out in this panel of cities, of places that have started to scale back mass incarceration. In fact, it delivers more public safety than the system we currently have.
Great, thank you. And we will come back to some of those themes. I wanted to ask Pete, we had some conversation about the impact that criminalization has on feeding things. I'd love the perspective on decriminalization and kind of how this cycle back and forth can have some consequences of impact as well.
Sure. There's no question that the war on drugs is inextricably linked to generational poverty. The war on drugs has created a tsunami of poverty in our urban ecosystems. I built one of the largest cannabis companies in the world, and saw firsthand how hard it was to bring people whose lives were impacted by the war on drugs into my business. I saw that firsthand. Let me give you a couple quick examples. In the state of Illinois, if you were an AIDS patient, but you had a felony, you didn't get medicine up until a year ago. That's right, you had to be fingerprinted to get medicine, because if you were a felon, you didn't deserve medicine. In Maryland, you had to be drug tested to work in a marijuana dispensary, still do. In Pennsylvania, if you have any marijuana misdemeanor of any kind, and of course we all know that you're 7.5 times more likely to be arrested and incarcerated for marijuana in Pennsylvania if you're black than if you're white, but if you had any marijuana misdemeanor in Pennsylvania, you could not work in the industry. So we've created this system that I call as double jeopardy. Once again, rich white people rise to the top, and we take advantage of the minority communities. And this double jeopardy is being set up. We created this system that was as akin to slavery as anything I've known in the form of mass incarceration. And we catalyzed generational poverty via the war on drugs, starting with Nixon and actually with Clinton as well. And you should know that Bill Clinton incarcerated 2 times more minorities than any president in history. And that's just a fact. And we also changed the seizure laws in this country, which actually incentivized local police officers to go into poor urban areas and find people who they could easily convict and grab their assets because they were incentivized to take those assets and put them back into their own pockets. That is how the system is set up. It's a flawed system. They're not going to come to my house because they know they're not going to get in, and I'm going to call my $1,000 an hour an attorney and not let them in. But that doesn't happen in our urban ecosystems. And so this whole thing has been set up to really fail. And now that legalization is sweeping the countries, 11 states, with my home state of Illinois in the last month included, we're going to leave the minorities at the altar once again if we don't do something and do something quickly. We have a moral imperative. We built this industry on the backs of the minorities whose lives were destroyed. And now we have a moral imperative to build them back up. And the last thing I'll say is this. You cannot you cannot do away with generational poverty with jobs. You do away with generational poverty by creating generational wealth. And that is not $15 an hour at a time. We have to create platforms and programs that allow people whose families have been incarcerated or harmed by the war on drugs to get equity and to be owners and to be able to compete aggressively with the white individuals who are running the marijuana industry today. And that's one of the reasons I retired too, is you grow a business, you built it in a multi-billion-dollar company, you go public, and all of a sudden, there's a little bit of mental atrophy sets in. You gotta focus on, no offense to people out here, but you gotta focus on shareholders and appeasing analysts and appeasing everybody else, and then you kind of forget about the reason you did it in the first place. And the reason I did it is because I believe that the damage done in the war on drugs was so evil for our society that legalizing marijuana and cannabis was the path to recreate this vision of an equal society. So I'm eager to talk about that today.
Thank you. And so, Monica, if you could also share some insights. I know you have had a lot of experience at the individual and family level, and would love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, so I'm happy. Prior to coming to RFK, I was a public defender. In my last job as a public defender, I represented children, 16 to 20-year-olds, that were attempting to get paroled out of Louisiana prisons. And so my focus was on kids who had been imprisoned from New Orleans and the surrounding parishes, because there we had parishes, not counties. And so one of my favorite kids, his name was Rahman, and his mother's name was Valerie. And when he was first incarcerated for the first 6 months, he was at a prison that was very close to their home. And she was able to visit him every other week. He was a total, and remains a total mama's boy, and I think that's part of why I found him to be so charming. And so I would visit him frequently, his mother could visit him frequently, and then because of administrative reasons, which had nothing to do with his behavior or anything he was doing at prison, he was moved from the local prison to one that was 4.5 hours each way from his family and from anyone that he actually knew. And so his mother has 3 other children who she raises, and she was not able to visit him. So for 12 months, they had no in-person contact except for when he would come back and forth to court, and she would then only be allowed to hug him briefly while he was still in shackles. And so you can imagine the strain on the relationship and how much stress that caused not only for him, but also for his family. And so, of course, as a parent, she wanted to provide for him while he was in prison. However, again, back to commissary, is privately ran, and so for instance, one small thing, one packet of tuna, which we have all seen, you can buy at a bodega in New York City for $1.59. If you have public assistance, you could use public assistance to purchase that and put it into a box and send it to your incarcerated child. However, when you're in prison, you are not allowed to receive packages that have content such as food. And so the only way that he could purchase a packet of tuna was through the commissary, and the prices ranged between $2.75 and $3 for that same exact packet of tuna. And so you can see how over time, it may not seem like $1 here, $1 there, but this is a mother who was struggling to raise 3 other children at home. In addition to that, there were fees charged on top of the amount that you would like to send, on top of that to send money through to prison. So there's a system called JPay, and they charge a surcharge for every amount. So to send $10, you have to pay $3.50. And so you can see how it just snowballs for families, and it creates lots and lots of crises for them: financial crisis, emotional strain, emotional toll of not being able to see your child. And then it's incredibly expensive to even talk on the telephone. So in Louisiana at the time, it was $3.75 for every 15 minutes that she would get to speak with her child. And so I personally, regrettably, talk to my mom every single day. She calls me every day. And so I'm like, maybe I can get prison phone on mine so she won't call me as much. But we don't want to do that. But so $3.75 for 15 minutes. Again, it doesn't seem like a lot, but there are surcharges on top of that. And if you think about that being your only mode of communication to speak with your child, because you don't have the means to get to them in prison. And, you know, folks don't own their own cars, there's no public transportation, and there are a few handfuls of nonprofit organizations that will transport families to prisons, but they usually do them around holidays, and it's not a consistent way to see your own child. And so he was incarcerated for an additional 12 months away from his family. And then the judge accepted our motions and he was granted parole, and everyone was delighted. We reached out to his school and they said, yes, he may return. And with summer school, he was going to be able to graduate with his class. And we thought, oh, we have solved all the world's problems. And the mom, because she is conscious, she alerted her housing provider. She, of course, was in government housing and said, I need to add my child's name back to my lease. He'll be returning home. And the authorities said, no, he can't return home because he's been charged and convicted of a felony offense. And so now he cannot return to your home. And so we scrambled and we found an aunt who was not living in public housing, and he was able to return to her care until we got it straightened out. Thankfully, I came from a very well-resourced public defender's office. We had social workers, and we were able to get a letter from the judge saying that, you know, this child poses no threat to society. He can live peacefully, and that it's in his best interest that he be returned to the custody of his mother and be able to graduate from his high school. And so he spent a couple of weeks with his aunt when he came home, and then he was able to return home. But this story is actually kind of an outlier for the ending, because so many of my clients absolutely cannot return home after paying their debt to society, after serving in prison or serving in jail, and they are kicked out of their housing, and it thrusts them into homelessness. And so, you know, this is just one story, and his outcome is actually extraordinary in the fact that he was able to return to his home. But I think that, you know, when we hear these numbers, which to me are completely and totally overwhelming about how much it costs, but it really hits home for me when you think about the cost of a packet of tuna and how much, you know, if I want to send $10 to my child who's in prison, but I actually have to send $13.50, and what that means for the other children in the household when I make, you know, less than $10 an hour as a single parent. And so I think for all of us, it's really important to not forget these families who, because of the system, have been greatly impacted.
Well, thank you. And I think that illustrates at an individual level. We've talked about kind of the broad, you know, kind of perspective of how the scale across the country is, and some risk of decriminalization, not necessarily being a fix-all, but potentially accelerant of some problems. I think before we go any further, what usually crops up very quickly is, yeah, but what about public safety? You know, because all of these things may be cost, but they may be the unfortunate cost of just keeping good people safe. And so I'd love to get the panelist point of view on, you know, kind of what, you know, is this model a necessary kind of element tied to a reduction from 1970 level crime rates to today, or is there more going on here?
Yeah, I mean, one question I have for maybe a little interactive. How many people in here, just by show of hands, have been in a maximum security prison? I mean, a handful. I would strongly encourage each of you to reach out to your local prison watchdog group or prisoners' rights group and donate $100 and go on a visit. I've done it a number of times. And every time I come back and I tell my wife the same thing. And I went recently, and I wrote up a big synopsis of my visit to the Pontiac Correctional Institution in Illinois, one of the harshest maximum penalty facilities in Illinois. And I said, these people are no different than me. I mean, I literally sat toe to toe this far away from murderers, without shackles on, with drug convicts. And we had conversations, and their smile was just as nice as mine, and they were just as intellectually capable as I was. Yet they lived in an 11-by-7 cell, and some of them for 10, 20, 30 years at a time. That is not a humane way to treat human beings. And so in order I would say, go see it firsthand and experience it firsthand. Every state has a watchdog group where you can do that and really understand, the treatment. And in terms of letting these people out to society, I mean, I think we have to study the Portugal model. And there are other models too, but study the Portugal model. I mean, they realized they were spending $18 billion a year on incarcerating drug addicts, when in reality, drug addiction is a public health issue, not a criminal justice issue. And they took that $18 billion, they decriminalized all drugs, they invested $10 billion in the most wonderfully federally funded rehabilitation program, and guess what? In 13 years, drug addiction is down 70%. Because they realize that keeping people out of jail is giving them purpose and giving them education. And so I think if you give people purpose and education and hope and opportunity, and avoid them being an 11-by-7 cell in segregation like 100,000 people in this country are, I think we can be a lot better society, a lot healthier society than we are today.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad we're having the conversation about public safety, because it's so often invoked as the justification for the system we have. That, sure, 81 billion sounds like a lot of money, but if it gives us public safety, then that's money well spent, right? And I think many of us in this room might be like, well, that's just the cost of doing business. But here's what we know is that, in fact, more incarceration doesn't deliver more public safety. I know that sounds strange. I actually saw somebody literally make a face of like, wait, what do you mean? That's always been what we have told ourselves and what has been sold to us in the media. There are 11 million arrests that happen in this country annually. Less than 5% are arrests that involve any kind of violence or physical harm to another person. And that's what gets invoked, though, day in and day out, to say we need to spend this money on incarceration because what about public safety? And so, Pete talked about Portugal and the incredible sort of lesson that we learned about if you decriminalize drugs and you actually respond to drug use with treatment and treat it like it is, which is a public health issue, you actually get much better returns. And the other thing is you save money. But other countries like Germany and Norway have incarceration rates that are literally a fraction of ours. Germany has an incarceration rate that is 1/7 of ours here in this country. And yet they also have public safety that is better than ours. And why? It's because they've invested in the social safety net. People are involved in crime because basic needs go unmet. It goes to the generational poverty issues that really drive how our systems work. One of the things that I was actually just in Germany and Norway a couple weeks ago visiting prisons there. I'm somebody who has gone to maybe hundreds of jails and prisons over the years, both as a public defender. I represented people charged with all levels of crime, and then also in my work as a researcher and policymaker in criminal justice reform. And let me tell you about one prison in Norway. It's called Haldon in a small town outside of Oslo. There's about 250 men incarcerated there. It's people charged and convicted of murders, of rape, the most serious kinds of offenses you can imagine. It is that small 5% of cases that do involve violence. And here's what the prison looks like. There's a huge wall that surrounds it. There's no way anybody can scale it or escape. And interestingly enough, in the time that the prison has been open for over 10 years, nobody has even once tried to escape. You walk in, and the first thing that struck me is I don't actually know who is incarcerated here and who works here. The men who are incarcerated there choose to wear their own clothes. If they don't have clothes that their families have sent for them, they are allowed to earn money to buy clothes at a reasonable cost, the same as what it would cost on the outside. Every single day, the men there are either working, or they are in school, or they're in some sort of other program where they wake up, they go to a job, or they go to school. They actually get paid, and they get paid a decent wage to be doing that. And they are taught classes from everything from budgeting and saving to cooking to life skills. All of these things that there is no American prison or jail that does anything even close to this. And one of the expectations, because the vast majority of people who go away to jail and prison actually come back to our communities, it's over 95% here in this country, and in Germany and Norway, it's pretty much close to everybody, is that they make sure that when you leave prison, we're first of all going to make sure that we have connected you with a job, with housing. Nobody leaves without those things set up. That's very different than in New York State, which is where I practice as a public defender. The people I represented would walk out of prison with literally $40 and maybe a bus ticket. That's it. And so in Norway, they make sure that you actually have money. All of that money you earned from being in school or working while you're in prison actually gets saved up, and that money is given to you. So you might get a check of over $5,000 as you leave, with some help on the outside to make sure that you budget properly, that you have a first and last month's security deposit. All of these really basic things that invest in your success and to keep you out of prison or jail rather than to come back in. Here we know that the return to sort of incarceration rate is literally 2/3 of people who come out of our prisons end up going back in at some point within 3 to 5 years. That is just not the case in Germany and in Norway. They've actually figured out, well, if we have this opportunity because you broke the law and we have you incarcerated, the punishment is taking away your liberty. You don't get to be with your family, you don't get to be in the community. But beyond that, we're going to invest in you because we believe in your worth, and we also believe it is better for us as a society and better for public safety to make sure that when you leave, you never come back.
Great. Well, I think we'll take one more round of discussion items here, and then we'll open it up. So if you have questions in mind, be ready for them in a moment. But we mentioned Portugal and Germany, and I think embedded, Insha, in your observations around things that are different in Germany. There were hints at a few things, but I was wondering if each of the panelists, if you were to kind of design a system that would have equal or higher public safety and kind of lower direct societal cost to us, cost of the actual system, and potentially better kind of secondary and tertiary economic impacts, what would be the key either policy provisions or adjustments that you would recommend?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things is providing people with some form of hope while they are incarcerated. I think for so many, they feel like they're gone, they're tucked away, no one visits them, they don't have any access to resources. I mean, state budgets have gotten tight, and then also private prisons have come in, and so there used to be a fairly robust educational system available to people who are in prison. Currently, that's really not the case. They're slashing government funding for educational programs. And so you may have, for instance, in juvenile prisons, been able to get like an OSHA card where you could learn a trade, or you could learn how to become an electrician or a welder, and all of those things have really been eliminated. And so you're taking away someone's freedom, and you're expecting them to go out into society with little or no resources, and they have absolutely nothing. On a local level, one opportunity, and then also funding has been cut for Pell Grants and further educational opportunities for people who have served time in prison. But on a more really small levels in your own community, there are reentry programs which need support. They need social workers, they need lawyers to go in and litigate these cases. And so, if you have a well-funded justice system, fewer people are going to enter the system, but those who do enter and then exit have a better chance of successfully re-entering society and becoming productive citizens when they have supports and when they're able to return to their own homes. And so really addressing local policies of exclusionary housing practices, or simple things like not asking about people's felony history or criminal history when they're applying for jobs, and offering opportunities to returning citizens. Those are things that all of us can do in our own daily lives, which I think make a huge difference.
Yeah, all of us, whether we're sitting here at this conference or sitting on death row, have one basic human need, which is fulfillment. We all seek fulfillment, and we all define that a little bit differently. And so what other countries have done, and I think what we could do here as a policy matter, is we could think about, as people leave prison, how do we engage them and help them become fulfilled and help them replace what was once a destructive behavior potentially with something that is purpose-filled. And what I advocate for is what they have done in other countries. When you get out of prison, if you've achieved certain standards and certain good behavior, you get a loan or a micro loan to start a business. Because what they find is that becomes your purpose. Your purpose before might have been destructive, may have been addiction, may have been whatever it was. But if you can replace that with another purpose, in this case, opening a lemonade stand, a Subway franchise, a flower shop, whatever it might be, you become addicted to that. That becomes your purpose, and that becomes meaningful. And so I think a microloan, and this system has worked in other countries with great results, by the way. This is not just something that is pie in the sky. There's anecdotal evidence to believe that this actually works. So we have to replace their former purpose with a new purpose and a new opportunity. And I think that that goes along with what I think is a kind of a national apprenticeship program. And again, in order to create generational wealth to replace generational poverty, which often is the cause of incarceration in many cases, we have to create an apprenticeship program so that these people can learn how to work in a wealthier environment to then go off and start businesses for themselves and become wealthy themselves and then help their family and generations thereafter avoid the incarceration system.
So I couldn't agree more with Monica and Pete that investing in people is just a key way to change how our system works. I want to shift the frame a little bit to invest in local government and the services that governments provide. And let me just give an example of New York City. Back in the early 1990s, New York City had over 20,000 people in jail on any given day. And the homicide rate in New York City was over 3,000 murders a year. Today, New York City has about 7,500 people in jail. That's an almost 60% decline in the jail population. And our homicide rate last year was less than 300. How did that happen? So New York City basically made a decision to say, we could just build more incarceration, more jail beds. But instead what they decided to do was they picked out the 20 communities across New York City where the vast majority of people were getting arrested and coming through the system and ending up in jail. And in those communities, they put in programs such as community-based health care providers, better after-school programs, better treatment programs. And it was literally a structural shift, a decision to spend our government resources in communities, in supports, and not in more incarceration. And that is something, those are decisions that each and every county, city, state in this country can make. And it's actually cheaper than investing in incarceration. Jail and prison is by far the most expensive option that we have to respond to crime. Treatment, education, more programs, the social service net is far, far cheaper, and it delivers better results.
Great. Well, thank you. And with that, I'd like to open it up if there are questions in the audience, and I believe there are microphones available. So if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll bring a mic to you.
Hi there, Colin Tate is my name from top1000funds.com and Connexus Financial in Australia. Insha, I'm particularly interested in your commentary around the economics as being the turning point on policy or re-policy formulation.
Yep.
So who are these beneficiaries? Are the public pension plans and institutional asset owners in this room benefiting from the incarceration? And if so, what is the next steps if there's something to be done about this?
Yeah. So many companies, many retirement plans in all sorts of ways that you both know of and perhaps aren't even aware of, they invest in the private companies that fuel our system of criminal justice and incarceration, right? And so that's everything from the 9 main insurance companies that are the backers of all of the bail bondsmen that you see on the main street in every single city in this country. Or it's, certainly we know of the private prisons, and they are run by corporations that turn a huge profit each and every day. And some of our insurance plans and our pension plans are invested in those companies. But it's also companies that work within public institutions, public jails and prisons, that run the telephones, that run the food. The same company that provides dining room services for the vast majority of colleges and universities in this country provides food in the vast majority of jails and prisons in this country. Likewise, for phones, for laundry, for you name it, right? Private health care in a public jail or prison is really common. And so I think in your question really is, what can we do about this? And I think as investors to really know, like when you're investing, who are those, where you're investing and what are their relationships to these companies? There's an incredible resource put out by this organization called Worth Rises. And it's basically a phone book of all of the private companies that have any sort of investment or profit interest in the criminal justice system, from literally policing to private probation to, working within jails and prisons. It's a great resource, and happy to sort of share it around, and the materials from this convening, is I think it's a great place to start to get sort of educated, to spot these are the companies I should be looking out for, or putting pressure on as an investor to sort of use your bully pulpit to help them think through like how they are operating and the ways in which they're operating.
Hi, my name is Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, and I'm really glad to hear that you're focused on this. I was the lieutenant governor. I was in charge of our crime system, criminal justice system, and I think it's really great to focus on education in the prisons, job training in the prisons, and what you can do when you can get out of prisons. Obviously, job training and housing. We learned that housing was absolutely the #1 issue when people are getting out, because a lot of their family does not actually want to see the prisoners. They've had enough of them. But I also think it's important to show that there are things that you can do to reduce crime in the first place. And I'm just going to boast about what we were able to do in Maryland. We focused on what we called hotspots and put more police, probationers, community organizers, after-school activities, and said we're going to reduce crime in those hotspots, the highest crime areas, by 30% in 3 years. And we succeeded, not by moving crime to one place or another, but actually reducing crime. And that, to me, is the most successful way, because let's figure out how, and we did that by training and by also increasing the probation salaries by 30%. Because as you said, most people who commit crime have already committed another crime. About 75% of the people who've committed crime have already committed a crime. So rather than just do across the board, focus in the areas that they're about to commit crime or have already done it. And you can really be much more effective that way. And I think, as you said so eloquently, you focus on the system, you know where the crime's going to be committed, you know who's going to do it, focus there, and you can stop crime. And that is a really effective way of doing it. Then you don't have to worry about mass incarceration, except for the political people who want to create new crimes so they can fill their prisons and make money. Stop that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, Danny Wright. I'm one of the co-founders of Good. We run a collaborative of social impact organizations investing in underserved communities. I'm connected with the Georgetown Pivot Program, which is a new pilot program by Georgetown University to provide academic and entrepreneurship and business curriculums to returning citizens, and they just graduated their first cohort on Friday. And in doing so, over the course of the cohort, the Georgetown Pivot Program has these individuals build business models, work for different employers and getting paid across the way. Peter, you spoke about providing microloans to returning citizens and individuals that are getting out of the prison system. Do you see that as like a grant-making process? Do you see that as investments by a fund? What does that look like? Because one of my board members is actually the managing director of this program, and I would like to give her some insights and resources about how we can better serve this population.
Sure, it's a great question. I'd be happy to talk to your managing director. I'm a big believer that if we're going to replace generational poverty with generational wealth, that we have to do it through community-based entrepreneurship. I mean, you drive through any poor urban ecosystem in America, and what do you see? You see medical deserts, food deserts, pharmacy deserts, commerce deserts, everything deserts, right? And if you train people in a safe place it's conducive to entrepreneurship, to become entrepreneurs in their communities. And again, jobs are great. I hear every politician talk about jobs. But at $15 an hour plus benefits, who's going back to reinvest in their community? No one. So we have to create community-based entrepreneurship. So one of the things that my foundation will be investing in is incubators. You notice where the incubators are? Incubators aren't in, for the gross generalization, but for the most part, incubators are in the Merchandise Mart in Chicago, which is connected to, formerly connected to the Kennedy family. But it's got an amazing incubator, maybe one of the best ones in the country, 1871. Palo Alto, Boulder. We have to put incubators that inspire community-based entrepreneurship in areas that have been impacted by the war on drugs. One of the first investments that my foundation will make is in a cannabis incubator. And in one of the worst parts of Chicago, training people how to become entrepreneurs in the cannabis sector. Meet them right where they're at in their community and teach them how to start businesses in their community. I think that's how we've replaced generational poverty with generational wealth, community-based entrepreneurship.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question before we...
Hi. Tom Soto from California. I had the great, our challenge fortune of being the vice chair of the Board of Corrections for 10 years of the state of California, and was probably the first person on that board appointed by Gray Davis and then laid over by Schwarzenegger that didn't pack heat and wasn't a cop. And it really is the culture of indifference that exists at that level. And there wasn't a very Jesuit approach to the administration of this system, where at that point in time, it was about $140,000 per cell and about $45,000 per year. And it was an average daily population of 86,000. We're now about 130,000. It costs about $200,000 per door and about $80,000 a year. And when I became a member, I actually remember the phone call from Gray Davis, who called, and he had Susan Kennedy on the line, who was his chief of staff, a relation. He indicated that they were spending more money on prisons than community college in the Cal State system. And Tom, can you figure out as an entrepreneur how to make this trend go the other way? And it wasn't within minutes of going to a tour of the Boot, for example, in San Quentin, then Corcoran, and understanding what I was seeing. I wasn't seeing violent offenders. I was seeing mental health offenders. And because I had the throw weight of the governor, I was able to get our bond holder, Goldman, to prescribe money to 4 different counties. And we also hired a survey firm to look at the prison population and found that 20-some% of our inmate population, although was not in line with what the administration thought, but they said about 20% are mental health offenders and shouldn't even be in this silo. So I was able to successfully allocate money from our bond to each of the counties to do mental health offender outreach and education with local enforcement agents. And after that year, it was the first time that we saw a reduction in the prison population on a daily basis by about 1,200, and then it succeeded to go down further. My point is that there are ways of looking at this on an incremental basis from a cost standpoint to justify non-traditional approaches to administration, whether it's your architecture, whether it's design of the buildings, but it's also who's going in. because if you're an OCD, ADHD, schizophrenic, and you're behaving certainly different, and a cop who has authority touches them in a certain way, they're going to respond differently, and that puts them in a different file. And once they're in the violent offender file, now you're triggering hundreds of thousands of dollars of cost to society as opposed to mental health and social services. It would be helpful to maybe build a wider coalition of building financial institutions to look at this question, who might be able to find it more profitable to see it in that light.
With that, I think we'll segue. I'm going to give each panelist a moment to make any kind of concluding statements. I think the two things to keep in mind is, you have a room of very engaged and active investors or people involved in the investment community, and we're entering into a deeper part of an election cycle. And so with those two things in mind, if there are any kind of parting wisdom, advice, or thoughts that you'd like to convey, we can start with Monica and work our way down.
Sure, I would just say, these are, as we heard earlier, the Manhattan District Attorney Office, for instance, is using funds that have been collected from civil fines and fees to open up gyms in neighborhoods where there are lots of underserved young adults who were, frankly, getting into trouble on Friday and Saturday nights. And so they're using those fines and fees to open up gymnasiums and turn on the lights and have a safe space for people to come and to be safe and to be in their own communities and to build community. And so not through the prosecutor's office, but there are many, many, many organizations, big and small and medium, in your own communities that are doing amazing work. They're doing amazing preventative work. They're working to strengthen our schools. They're working to strengthen families. And those organizations often don't have the opportunity to speak to a room of individuals such as yourselves, and they don't have the opportunity to be connected with Robert F. Kennedy human rights. And so part of our work and what I intend to do is to really uplift smaller organizations so that we are more on the preventative side. But for folks who have unfortunately entered the system, the criminal justice system, and are returning citizens, I think, create fellowships, internships, and opportunities for returning citizens to become really parts of our community and to welcome them home and to provide them with opportunity is what each and all of us can do. And, take a look at your portfolios and think about, is this really where are your values aligned with these companies? And certainly to visit the website that Insha mentioned for that. So I think all of us can do things that are very small and that are very great, but they all will have an impact in the end upon our communities and the communities of individuals that we serve.
Yeah, thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I would say relative to the next political cycle, which is going to be a rather important one in this country, don't believe the hype around legalization and decriminalization. It is not enough. Yes, we've seen some bills and its progress, but decriminalizing and legalizing cannabis is not enough. If someone hasn't been working for 15 years and they have a 15-year gap on their resume, it's unlikely that they're going to get a job, and they're certainly not going to get a job and be able to raise capital to go create wealth that replaces that generational poverty that they've been a victim of. So we have to create educational systems and infrastructure that allow for those people to scale, and we have to have policy that allows people to be educated and to compete one-for-one with their white suburban peers. That is really important. Decriminalization, legalization, not enough. The other thing is invest in companies that are investing in public education. I hear all the time as I travel the country about charter schools this, charter schools that. That's great. Guess what? We have 43 million kids in non-charter public schools. We're just going to try and solve that with the charter schools. That won't work. We have to stop spending so much money on incarcerating people. And by the way, if you look at the numbers, go state by state, you look at the numbers, the money that should be spent on public education is being spent on mass incarceration. And so if we kind of redeployed that money to public education, public schools in this country, and had helpful intervention platforms that intervene with children who are going through difficult, traumatic stuff in their communities or with their families, we keep a lot more kids out of jail, we get them a lot more educated, and we create generational wealth that replaces generational poverty. So invest in companies that are thinking thoughtfully about how to allow public education in this country to progress.
So I love these appeals to your financial power, and I think that that's exactly right. I'm going to appeal to your political power, as many of us are voters. And there's obviously the big election that's going to come up in 2020. But one of the things that I think is so important to care about are local elections. And many of you this year will have a local district attorney's race. And district attorneys hold a tremendous amount of power about whether or not to even take an arrest and move forward with it and charge it, or what they are offering in terms of a plea offer, whether that involves treatment versus jail or prison. Those races are incredibly important. And the vast majority of prosecutors run as incumbents without any challengers, because it's a position that hasn't until very recently gotten any light, any attention in our system. So I urge people to go out and get educated about their local criminal justice system, who their prosecutors are. And then at the state level, we have seen state after state introduce bills to legalize marijuana. So in my home state, New York, we just lost on a really important marijuana legalization bill that actually the sticking point was this issue of equity. In the bill, as our legislators had introduced it, was a provision to make sure that the proceeds from marijuana legalization would actually be reinvested in communities, not just simply go into the hands of the investors and the private companies. And that was actually sort of the death knell for the bill. Pretty much everybody was okay with legalization, but there was a very powerful lobbying faction that basically said, if we can't make profit from this, we're going to try and kill this bill and wait for another legislature where a bill that legalizes but allows for profit can move forward. So watch out for things like that, because those are the kinds of local pieces of legislation, local elections that make a world of difference. And besides your financial power, your political power can really work towards ending mass incarceration as we know it.
Great. Well, thank you. Hopefully you can join me in thanking Monica, Pete, and Insha for kicking off our panel.
Thank you.